Now, for our last bit about tissues, we're going to talk about muscle and nervous tissues. And I'm just going to show you these basic tissues, talk about their different functions. We're going to go into much more detail with these tissues when we do these systems. But for right now, let's just learn what these look like so that when we look at, say, a big image like this, we can recognize all these different tissues that we see. So there's three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue is so named because it moves your skeleton. I know, right? It is under voluntary control. So you always control whether this moves or not. Although it may be unconscious. You may be doing something like riding a bike or walking, which you don't think about. It's being done below the level of consciousness, but you're still doing it voluntarily. Cardiac muscle tissue is under involuntary control. You don't get to control whether your heart beats or not. It's just going to keep doing it. Your body is going to keep this tissue doing its thing regardless of what you do. The cardiac muscle tissue found in the heart. Cardia means heart, so it's only found in the heart. And then our final kind is smooth muscle tissue, and it's actually all over your body in lots of different places, and it is under involuntary control as well. It's going to just keep doing its thing regardless of what you do. The walls of the blood vessel are going to have smooth muscles so that they can dilate or constrict in response to the metabolic needs of tissues, whether you like it or not. We also see it in the wall of the digestive system. Fortunately, we don't have to think about digesting our food. Our digestive system just keeps doing it. And then inside the eye, the focusing of the eye and the control of the iris that lets light into the eye, that is going to be smooth muscle doing those motions. Okay, so first let's look at skeletal muscle. And it looks kind of cool. When I always like skeletal muscle. It's really it's just nice to look at, and it's very, very distinctive. It's got these really clear stripes in it. These are striations. Striations just mean stripes. And these are as a result of the protein fibers within the muscle overlapped in a regular and distinct way. And we'll talk about that when we do the muscle systems. Each skeletal muscle fiber or skeletal muscle cell, same thing, has a lot of nuclei, which is unusual. Most cells only have one, but skeletal muscle has a bunch of nuclei. So all of these things around here, these are all the nuclei of the muscle cells. There are also nuclei of supporting cells that go between these, but most of these are actually nuclei of the muscle cells themselves. These cells are very, very long, much longer than other cells, so that on here we actually can't see the end of the cells. Each of these is one cell. So where these white lines are, this is actually a thin layer of areolar connective tissue between the muscle cells themselves. So that's one muscle cell there. There's another muscle cell there, another muscle cell there. Okay, so that's skeletal muscle tissue, striated, multinucleated. Now, when we look at it at a lower magnification, sometimes the striations aren't as obvious, but when you look closely, you can still see them. You see these dark and light stripes. Again, here's a muscle fiber, so it's a very long cell. At low magnification like this, it can be really hard to see the nuclei, but if you look closely, you can start seeing them. Now, over here, what we have is a longitudinal section through muscle. So we went long ways like this. And then here we have a transverse section. So imagine that we cut through like this. So what we're seeing is each of the muscle cells cross-sectioned, and they're round. And then, so we have two parts of a muscle going in opposite directions, or two muscles going in opposite directions. And then between them with padding are adipocytes, a little bit of adipose in there. Remember, I told you it's everywhere. Cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, and I'll show you that in a minute. And it has dark bands at the ends of the cells that are called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs are full of gap junctions. Remember, we talked about those when we did cells, and we talked about intercellular junctions. Gap junctions are the ones that make a channel between the cytoplasms of two neighboring cells. The intercalated discs between cardiac muscle cells are full of gap junctions. Each cardiac muscle cell has one nucleus. It's a very distinct nucleus, and the cells are branched, which is something else that makes it distinct from skeletal muscle. The cells are also shorter than in skeletal muscle tissue. Now, some of your cardiac muscle cells are autorhythmic, meaning that they actually contract by themselves, even without a signal from the nervous system. It's a very cool thing about your heart that it can beat by itself without any signals from the brain. Again, we will come back and talk about that when we talk about the heart. So here's what cardiac muscle cells look like on a diagram. So here's a single cell, this lighter one here, and you can see that it's one part at one end, it's clearly striated, one nice big nucleus, and then it's branched at the other end. And then between the striations, we have these darker lines, and those are the intercalated discs. This is a magnification of this intercellular area. So you can see they've taken apart the intercalated discs, and you can see all of these gap junctions. So that when one cell becomes electrically excited or its electrical force changes, that goes directly to the next cell. And this is what cardiac muscle tissue looks like on a microscope slide. So you can see here's an intercalated disc, here's another one, here's another one. The striations are much lighter color than the intercalated discs. The nuclei of the cells are very distinct. Again, you won't see them in all the cells because of the way the tissue is sectioned. They might have been sectioned, on one side or the other of the nucleus, and you just don't see it. But you can also see that these cells are branched or bifurcated, okay? Now, the final type of tissue is smooth muscles, final type of muscle tissue. Smooth muscle, it's not striated. Its individual cells are tapered at each end. Smooth muscle acts a little differently, whereas cardiac muscle just constantly contracts. Skeletal muscle can contract quickly or slowly depending on the demands on it. Smooth muscle tissue tends to contract fairly slowly, but it's very, very resistant to fatigue. And in some places, such as between organs in your digestive system, bands of smooth muscle tissue stay contracted all the time, and they only open and relax when food moves from one part of the digestive system to another. So smooth muscle tissue, again, we see them in the wall of the digestive system or the gut, in the walls of the blood vessels. They're all under involuntary control. And this is what it looks like on a microscope slide. So you can see the oval cells. If you look carefully, you can kind of see the edges of cells. They can be kind of hard to distinguish where the ends of the cells are. But the nucleus is long, but it's not quite as smushed as it is in dense regular connective tissue, okay? You might look at this and say, I don't know, that kind of looks like dense regular connective tissue. It does. It looks like there's a bunch of fibers going in one direction. But unlike in dense regular connective tissue, we have cells that don't look quite as smushed. We have a little bit of space between the cells that we don't see in dense regular connective tissue. And if we look carefully, we can see, let's see, oh, here's one. We can see kind of oval cells with that are elongated and tapered at the ends. Okay, so that's how you're going to distinguish those. So when you look at a microscope slide, a lot of times you're going to see larger samples like this. So here is dense irregular connective tissue. And you can see a lot of the fibers are kind of going in one way, but then they sort of branch out and twist. You won't see that in dense regular connective tissue. And then here you see a small group of smooth muscle tissue cells. You can see there's a lot more cells in the smooth muscles, a lot more nuclei visible than in either the dense regular or irregular connective tissue. And it's a little more organized, and it doesn't have the distinct collagen bundles. Okay? By the way, these are blood vessels here, and this is also smooth muscle in the walls of those. Okay? All right, so here we can see the difference between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle right next to each other. And then we also have some connective tissue. Can you guess what it is? It's areolar. Yeah, that's areolar connective tissue. So here we have the skeletal muscle nicely striated. We can see the multiple nuclei per cell. Smooth muscle, lots more nuclei than we see in the connective tissue. And if we look closely, we can kind of see tapered cells. They can be very, very hard to see. But it's all going in one direction, much more even, not striated the way smooth or cardiac muscle is. Okay, so this is a place where we have skeletal muscle next to smooth muscle. And we have that in some places, like for example, in the eye, you have muscles that are skeletal muscle tissue that move your eye around. And then inside the eye, we have smooth muscle that adjusts the size of the iris. You also have skeletal and smooth muscle, for example, around your throat for swallowing. So there are places where we see that kind of thing. All right, now nervous tissue looks completely different from everything else. The main cells in nervous tissue are called neurons, and they are really big, and they have all of these branches coming off of them. We will talk about all of this when we do the nervous system. What I want you to know at this point is to be able to recognize that this is a neuron tissue or nervous tissue sample. If you start to think, I don't know, this maybe looks like areolar connective tissue or something, realize that this is one cell. Okay, we don't see cells that large in something like an areolar connective tissue, although we do see strands like this. Okay, but we don't see as much protein fibers or as many fibers or strands as we see in a connective tissue. So this is definitely distinct. The other thing is, around the neurons, we have all these tiny little dots, and that's another type of cell. They're called glial cells, and they are supportive cells that help the neurons do their job. Again, we'll come back to these, talk about those when we talk about the nervous system. But for right now, all you need to recognize is that this is nervous tissue, and this is a neuron, and these little tiny things are glial cells. And we do have, in some cases, this place where skeletal muscle and a neuron meet. We have something called a neuromuscular junction. This is our same word construction, neuron, muscle. We make both of them adjectives, take off the end of the first, replace it with an O, neuromuscular. This is a junction between the end of a neuron and the muscle, and it's this special flattened area right there. And if you look really closely, you can kind of see the striations in the skeletal muscle, although this is not a great image, so they're kind of hard to see. So that's the end of our tissues chapter. Next up, we're going to talk about the integumentary system, which is your skin, which is going to helpfully review all of these tissues for you.